The first thing I noticed was the smell. Not a strange smell, not anything unpleasant, just lavender. The same lavender perfume my grandmother had worn for as long as I could remember. I was standing in her kitchen when I caught it. The house had been empty for almost 3 weeks by then. At least, it was supposed to be. I remember stopping with a cardboard box in my hands and looking around the room. The window above the sink was closed. The heater wasn't running. Nothing had changed. But for a few seconds, it felt like she had just walked through the room. Then the smell faded. I told myself it was coming from one of her old sweaters. That seemed reasonable. At the time, I still believed there was an explanation for everything. My grandmother passed away in early January. She was 84 and had lived in the same house for nearly 50 years. A small white house at the end of a quiet street in Indiana with a narrow front porch and a maple tree in the yard. I spent a lot of my childhood there. Summer afternoons in her kitchen, Christmas mornings in the living room, the sound of her radio playing softly while she baked. Every room in that house carried a memory. After the funeral, my mother asked if I could help clean it out. I was 26 and working remotely, so I agreed. The plan was simple. Spend a few days sorting through her things, pack what we wanted to keep, donate the rest, and get the house ready to sell. I decided to stay there while I worked. It felt strange at first, but not upsetting. The house still looked exactly the same. Her reading glasses sat beside her favorite chair. A half-finished crossword puzzle was still on the coffee table. The calendar in the kitchen still showed January. It almost felt as though she had stepped out for groceries and would be back soon. The first night was quiet. I ordered takeout, watched television in the living room, and fell asleep on the couch. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up. I didn't know why. The television had gone dark, and the house was completely silent. I sat there for a minute, listening. Then I heard it. A soft creak. From upstairs. I looked toward the staircase. Nothing. The house was old. It made sounds all the time. Wood settles, pipes cool. I knew that. I lay back down. A few seconds later, I heard it again. Another creak, then another. Slowly, like someone moving carefully across the floor above me. I sat up. My grandmother's bedroom was upstairs. So was the guest room. No one else was there. I waited. The sound stopped. I remember feeling embarrassed for being nervous. I was alone in an old house at 3 in the morning. Of course, every sound seemed louder. Eventually, I went back to sleep. The next day, I spent most of my time packing boxes. By evening, the living room looked different, emptier. I wrapped framed photographs in newspaper and carried them to the dining room. One of the last things left on the shelf was a picture of my grandmother holding me when I was 5. I picked it up. Then I froze. The frame beside it was warm. Not hot, just warm. I touched it again. The photograph inside was of my grandfather. He had passed away nearly 10 years earlier. I remember staring at it for a long time. The rest of the shelf felt cool. Only that frame was warm. I finally picked it up and carried it into the dining room. By the time I put it down, it felt normal again. That night I called my mother. I almost mentioned it. Instead, I asked if Grandma ever talked about Grandpa after he died. My mother was quiet for a second. Then she laughed softly. She said Grandma used to tell everyone that he never really left the house. I asked what she meant. She said sometimes Grandma would talk to him while she cooked. Sometimes she'd leave his favorite chair untouched because she said he was sitting there. She never sounded frightened by it, just matter of fact, like it was perfectly normal. I didn't know what to say to that. After we hung up, I sat in the kitchen for a while.
The house felt different suddenly. Not scary, just occupied. Like I wasn't entirely by myself anymore. That night I slept upstairs. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to feel closer to the memories. My grandmother's bedroom was exactly as she'd left it, the quilt on the bed, the lamp beside it, a small clock ticking softly on the dresser. I fell asleep quickly. Then I woke up to the sound of the rocking chair. At first, I thought I was dreaming. The chair stood in the corner of the room beside the window. I couldn't see it clearly in the dark, but I could hear it. A slow wooden creak. Forward, back, forward, back. I didn't move. I lay there staring into the darkness. The sound continued. Not fast, not aggressive, just steady, the way someone might rock gently while thinking. I finally reached for my phone. The screen lit up. The room was empty. The rocking chair wasn't moving. The sound had stopped. I sat there for a long time. Then I turned on the lamp. Nothing looked unusual. Eventually, I convinced myself that the noise had come from somewhere else. Old houses carry sound in strange ways. That had to be it. I slept with the light on. The next morning, I went downstairs to make coffee, and there, sitting on the kitchen table, was my grandmother's reading glasses. I stopped. I was sure I'd packed them. I remembered wrapping them in newspaper and placing them inside a box in the dining room. I walked into the dining room. The box was there, open. The newspaper inside had been unfolded. I stood there trying to remember. Maybe I never packed them. Maybe I thought I did. But deep down, I knew I had packed them. I put the glasses back in the box and taped it shut. The smell of lavender drifted through the room, very faint, then disappeared. That afternoon, I decided to finish early. I packed more books and folded clothes into donation bags. As the sun began to set, I noticed something strange. The house seemed quieter than before. Not silent, just waiting. I don't know how else to describe it. I was carrying a box down the stairs when I heard a soft laugh, a woman's laugh, very gentle, from the kitchen. I stopped immediately. The house was still. I stood there, listening. Nothing. I walked into the kitchen. Empty, but the smell of lavender was stronger than ever. For a moment, I could almost picture her standing by the stove. Then the feeling passed. That night, I decided I was done. I would come back with my mother and finish the rest together. I didn't want to spend another night there. I packed my bag and carried it to the front door. Then, I noticed something. The light in the living room was on. I didn't remember turning it on. I walked over to switch it off and stopped. The rocking chair was moving, very slowly, back, forward, back, back. The room was completely still. No windows open, no heater running. I stood there, unable to move. The rocking chair rocked one final time, then stopped. I don't remember how long I stood there. Eventually, I turned off the light, grabbed my bag, and left. I never stayed in that house again. A few months later, my mother sold it. The new owners renovated almost everything. New floors, new paint, different furniture. But last year, I happened to drive down that street. I slowed as I passed the house. The front porch looked different. The maple tree had been cut down. Everything had changed, except for one thing. In the front window, facing the street, sat an old wooden rocking chair, and for just a second, I could have sworn it was moving.
The first thing I noticed about the cabin was how untouched it felt. Not abandoned, not neglected, just paused. Like someone had stepped outside for a moment and never come back. I remember standing on the porch with the key in my hand, looking through the front window. The curtains were still open. A mug sat on the table beside a lamp.
There was even a jacket hanging by the door. My uncle had died 6 weeks earlier, and somehow the place still looked like it was waiting for him. The cabin sat on the edge of a small lake in northern Minnesota. No nearby neighbors, no streetlights, just a narrow dirt road that disappeared into the trees. I hadn't been there in years. When I was a kid, my parents used to bring me every summer. My uncle would take me fishing, teach me how to build fires, let me stay up too late watching the water turn black at night. Then life happened. I grew up, I moved away, and eventually I stopped visiting. When the lawyer called to tell me he'd left the cabin to me, I was surprised. We hadn't spoken much in the last few years. I almost sold it immediately. Instead, I decided to spend a weekend there first, just to clean it out, see the place one last time. I arrived just before sunset. The lake was perfectly still. No wind, no birds, even the trees seemed quiet. Inside, everything smelled faintly of cedar and old coffee. I walked from room to room slowly. The same couch, the same old rug, the fishing rod still leaning in the corner. It felt less like entering a building and more like stepping into a memory. I unpacked a few things, made coffee, and sat on the porch. As darkness settled over the lake, I found myself listening. Nothing. No traffic, no distant voices, just silence. The kind of silence you only get in places far away from other people. I slept surprisingly well that night. The next morning, I started going through my uncle's belongings. Most of it was ordinary: books, old photographs, receipts, a stack of letters tied together with string. I spent hours sorting through everything. Around noon, I found something strange: a second coffee mug, sitting beside the sink. I frowned. I was certain I'd only used one. I looked around the kitchen. Maybe it had already been there. Maybe I'd simply missed it. The cabin was full of things. I didn't think much of it. I washed both mugs and put them away. That evening, I built a fire in the stone fireplace. The flames filled the room with soft orange light. I remember feeling calm, more relaxed than I had in months. Then, I heard it. A creak from the hallway. I looked up. Nothing. Old cabin, I thought. Wood expands, wood settles. I added another log to the fire. A few minutes later, I heard it again. Another creak. Then silence. I waited. Nothing happened. Eventually, I forgot about it. Before bed, I checked the locks and turned off the lights. As I walked toward the bedroom, I glanced at the living room. One of the chairs had been moved. Not much, just a few inches. I stopped. I tried to remember where it had been before. Maybe it had always been there. I honestly couldn't tell. I laughed softly to myself. Being alone in a place full of memories does strange things to your head. I pushed the chair back and went to sleep. I woke sometime during the night. The room was dark. For a few seconds, I didn't know why I was awake. Then I heard it. The soft crackle of the fireplace. I sat up. I knew I had let the fire burn out. I was certain of it. I walked into the living room. The fire was dead. Only a few glowing embers remained. But the chair I'd moved before bed, was facing the fireplace again. I stared at it for a long time. Then I pushed it back once more and returned to bed. The next morning, I found another mug in the sink. This time, I was sure. I had washed both of them. There shouldn't have been anything there. I picked it up. It was warm. I actually checked the faucet to see if hot water had somehow dripped into it. Nothing. I stood there in the kitchen, mug in my hand, trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense. Eventually, I placed it back in the sink. I spent the rest of the day outside, cleaning the porch, checking the shed, trying to stay.
As evening approached, I noticed something. I didn't want to leave. The thought surprised me. I had planned to stay one weekend. Now I was considering another night, then another. The cabin felt comfortable, almost welcoming,
like it wanted to be lived in again. That night, I found an old photo album. Most of the pictures were familiar: fishing trips, birthdays, Christmas mornings. Then I found a picture of my uncle sitting in the living room. Across from him, in the chair by the fireplace, was another man. I didn't recognize him. On the back of the photo, my uncle had written, "Dad's favorite spot." I looked at the picture again. The chair, the fireplace, everything exactly as it still was. I suddenly remembered something. As a child, I used to think someone else lived in the cabin. Not physically, I just always had the strange feeling that another person was there. I hadn't thought about that in years. That night, I left the chair alone. I didn't move it. I sat on the couch instead. The fire burned low. The room was warm. At some point, I realized I wasn't afraid anymore. The strange things didn't feel threatening. They felt routine, as though someone else still had habits here: a place at the table, a favorite chair, an evening fire. I don't know how long I sat there. Then I heard it, a soft exhale. Not behind me, not beside me, from the chair. I looked up. The chair was empty, but I suddenly had the unmistakable feeling that someone was sitting there, watching the fire, the same way I was. The room felt full, not crowded, just occupied. I don't know why, but I said something out loud. I said, "You don't have to leave." The words surprised me. I hadn't planned to say them. Nothing happened. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the lake was completely still. Then I noticed something. The second mug. It was sitting on the table beside the chair. I hadn't put it there. I was sure of that. I stared at it for a long time. Then I got up, went into the kitchen, made another cup of coffee, and placed it beside the first. I sat back down. Neither of us moved. Eventually, I fell asleep on the couch. When I woke the next morning, sunlight filled the room. The second mug was gone, back in the kitchen, clean, sitting in the cabinet. I laughed quietly to myself. I don't know why. I should have been disturbed. Instead, I felt sad, as though someone had been keeping me company. I ended up staying another week, then another. Months passed. I kept finding reasons not to leave. I worked remotely. The cabin was peaceful. The lake was beautiful. But if I'm honest, that wasn't the real reason. The real reason was that I no longer felt alone there. Some nights, the chair would turn toward the fireplace. Sometimes I'd wake to find 2 mugs on the counter. Occasionally, I'd catch the faint smell of pipe tobacco, even though no one had smoked in that cabin for years. None of it frightened me. It felt familiar, like living with an old memory. Last autumn, I finally asked my mother about the man in the photograph. She looked at it for a long time. Then she smiled. "That's your grandfather," she said. I told her I didn't remember him. She nodded. "You were too young." Then she said something that made me go quiet. "He hated leaving that cabin." I asked what she meant. She smiled again. "He used to joke that even after he died, he'd still be sitting by that fireplace." I didn't tell her anything. I just folded the photograph and put it away. I still live at the cabin. People ask me sometimes if it ever feels lonely out there. I always tell them no, because it doesn't. Every evening, I light a fire, I make coffee, and I leave the chair exactly where it is, facing the flames. Sometimes, very late at night, I wake up and hear the soft creak of wood settling, then the faint sound of a chair moving a few inches across the floor. I never get up to check anymore, because after all this time, I don't think whatever stayed behind is trying to haunt the cabin. I think it's simply trying to live there. And some mornings, when I walk into the kitchen and find 2 mugs waiting by the sink, I have the strange feeling that one day, when I finally leave this place for the last time, someone might still put on a second pot.